Robots taking our jobs. It feels like it's always in the headlines, doesn't it? Like everywhere you turn, there's this fear of automation leaving a bunch of people out in the cold. And
Mm.
I mean, it's not just some abstract science fiction anymore, right? We see it every day.
It really does feel like it's ripped from the headlines, yeah.
It's self-checkout kiosks instead of cashiers, algorithms writing articles. Hey, heck, even Bill Gates himself is out there talking about taxing robots to, like, soften the blow.
Right.
So, for today's deep dive, we're tackling that question.
Yeah.
Should we tax robots? Hit the nail on the head. How does that sound for you?
It's a question a lot of people are asking, that's for sure. And I think it speaks to this very real anxiety about, as you said, automation leaving a lot of folks behind. But like any policy debate worth its salt, we need to look beyond the hype, look
Totally.
beyond just the headlines and really dive into the data, see what the numbers tell us.
Exactly.
And lucky for us, we've got some really solid analysis from economist Dominic Sachs to help us do just that.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little. Sachs's paper, it's called Optimal Taxation of Robots. In case you want to give it a read, well, it's pretty dense, full-on economist speak. But don't worry, we're not going to bog you down with all the technical jargon and models and stuff. What's really important here is the story that this model is telling us. The story about robots, wages, and whether slapping a tax on them is the right way to go.
Exactly. And the story starts with understanding that not all jobs are created equal when it comes to this whole automation thing. Sachs, he divides workers into three main categories: manual non-routine, routine, and cognitive non-routine.
So give me an example here. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, would a home healthcare aide be considered manual, non-routine?
Exactly. You got it.
Okay. Okay. And then like a factory worker on an assembly line, that would be routine.
Yep.
And then finally, your like software engineer coding away.
Yeah.
That's cognitive non-routine.
You
Yeah.
got it. You got it. And what Sachs's model does, and it's important to note here, he's using real data from the US economy. What he finds is that robots, they don't impact all three of these groups equally. And this is probably not going to surprise you, but it's those routine jobs, the ones that are the easiest to standardize, the easiest to, well, automate. Those are the ones that are most vulnerable.
Which makes sense when you
Yeah.
think about it, right? I mean, it's got to be way easier to program a robot to do the same repetitive task on an assembly line over and over than it is to, I don't know, teach it the nuances of caring for a patient at home or the creative problem solving of a software developer.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we see how the jobs break down, but how does all of this tie back into this whole robot tax idea?
So that's where things get really interesting. So when robots replace those routine jobs, what often happens is it squeezes the middle class. Wages get pushed down for those workers, while at the same time potentially boosting the incomes of those at the very top, the ones who own the robots. And that's where the idea of a robot tax comes in. The thinking is, by making robots more expensive, you could theoretically slow down the rate at which those middle income jobs are being automated, right? And that could potentially prevent those extreme wage disparities that we're talking about.
So it's like hitting the brakes on automation to give those middle income workers more of a fighting chance. Kind of a protectionist measure in a way.
Exactly.
Wow.
And at least in theory, a tax like this could generate revenue that could then be used to fund things like retraining programs for workers who've been displaced, maybe even bolster social safety net programs. So in that sense, it could be a tool for social good, a way of redistributing some of the gains of automation.
Okay, so on the surface, it sounds like this could be a win-win situation. Tax robots, protect jobs, fund social programs, everyone's happy, right? But I have a feeling it's not quite that simple. I mean, there have to be potential downsides to throwing a wrench in the gears of technological progress like this. What are we missing here?
You're right to be skeptical. It's never that simple. And the paper, it doesn't shy away from that. It's not presented as like a silver bullet solution by any means. One of the biggest concerns is that, well, taxing robots could end up stifling innovation.
That makes sense.
Right. Companies might be less likely to invest in new technologies if they know those technologies come with a hefty tax attached. And that could potentially slow down economic growth for everyone.
Okay.
And then there's also the practical question of, well, how do you even define a robot for the purpose of taxation? Is it that robotic arm we were talking about earlier in the factory? Is it a self-driving car? Like, where do you draw the line? It gets messy.
It gets really messy really fast.
Exactly.
So it sounds like, as with most policy decisions, we're talking about trade-offs here. Potentially protecting jobs, generating revenue on the one hand, but then maybe stifling innovation, complicating matters on the other. It sounds like the economic impact of this robot tax, it's not exactly a simple equation to solve. But this is where I think things get really fascinating because the paper actually digs into real-world data from the U.S. economy to try to model how this might actually play out.
Right, and this is where the work of economists Acemoglu and Restrepo comes in.
Okay.
Their research, which Sachs uses as a foundation for his own model, focused specifically on how robots have impacted wages right here in the US.
Okay.
And what they found is crucial to understanding the potential impact of this whole robot tax idea.
All right, spill the tea. What did Acemoglu and Restrepo find?
So they found that as robots become cheaper, and they are getting cheaper all the time, their impact on inequality might actually decrease.
Wait, hold on a sec. Cheaper robots, less inequality? That doesn't seem quite right, does it? Like, that seems kind of counterintuitive. Help me wrap my head around that.
I know, right? At first glance, it does seem a bit counterintuitive, but the key here is that when robots become cheaper, businesses, they adopt them much faster, right? Think about any new technology. The cheaper it gets, the more widespread it becomes.
Okay, that tracks. Like smartphones, for example. They were crazy expensive at first, but now, I mean, everyone and their grandma has one.
Precisely. So with robots, this rapid adoption, yeah, it leads to job losses in those routine tasks initially, like we talked about. But here's the twist. It also drives down the cost of production across the board.
Okay.
So suddenly it's cheaper to manufacture goods, to transport them, even to provide certain services. And those savings can trickle down to consumers in the form of lower prices.
So it's like this ripple effect, where cheaper robots mean that businesses, they save money, which then could lead to lower prices for everyone, even those folks who might have lost their jobs to automation in the first place.
You got it, exactly. And, because lower income households, they tend to spend a larger chunk of their income on those essential goods and services, those price drops. Those can have a disproportionately positive impact on their purchasing power, right?
Yeah.
And that, in turn, can help to narrow the inequality gap, even as some jobs are being displaced.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. So even if robots initially lead to some folks losing jobs in certain sectors, their overall effect on the economy is a bit more, well, nuanced than just robots bad, inequality worse.
Exactly. It's about taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture, looking at that interconnectedness of technological advancements, job markets, consumer prices, all of that. And that's what I think is so valuable about Sachs's paper, that he doesn't try to oversimplify things. He doesn't shy away from these complexities.
So where does that leave us then with this whole robot tax debate? If cheaper robots might actually help to mitigate inequality over the long term, does that make the argument for a tax kind of, I don't know, a bit weaker?
It definitely adds another layer to the discussion, that's for sure. Sachs, he acknowledges that a robot tax could have some positive effects in the short term.
Right.
Like we talked about, maybe slowing down the pace of automation a little, generating some revenue. But he ultimately concludes that the case for it is kind of weak,
Okay.
particularly when you consider those potential long-term impacts.
So if we're thinking about this strategically, just focusing on taxing robots might be, I don't know, maybe a little short-sighted.
That's how I see it. It's kind of like trying to hold back the tide, Technology, especially something as transformative as automation, it's very difficult to control with these simple policy levers like taxes.
Okay, so if a robot tax isn't this magic solution, what are some other ways we can maybe address the potential downsides of automation, make sure that the benefits are being shared more broadly, rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And this is where I think the conversation needs to shift away from just taxing robots and towards a more holistic approach to preparing for the future of work. One really promising avenue is investing in education and retraining programs.
Makes sense to me. Instead of trying to stop something that's probably going to happen anyway, we need to make sure people have the skills they need to succeed in a job market that's constantly evolving.
Exactly. And I'm not just talking about technical skills here either. Those are important, don't get me wrong, but we also need to focus on critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, all those skills that are a lot harder to automate and that are going to be in high demand in a future where it's humans and robots working side by side.
So it's less about trying to control technology and more about investing in, human capital.
Exactly. You said it better than I could.
Okay, it seems like we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the robot tax debate, the idea that cheaper robots could actually help with inequality, and the importance of investing in education and retraining. But before we wrap up, I'm kind of curious to dig a little deeper into how Sachs actually built this economic model that we keep talking about. You mentioned that it's based on real-world data, but can you walk me through how that works, in a little more detail?
Yeah, of course. So remember those three categories of workers we talked about earlier? Manual non-routine, routine, cognitive non-routine.
Yep.
So Sachs takes those categories and plugs them into this sophisticated economic model that simulates the impact of robots on wages.
So this isn't just theoretical, it's based on what's actually happening out there in the job market.
Exactly. He uses data on wages for each of those worker categories over time, see how they've been affected by automation so far, and then he uses the model to project how those trends might continue as robots become even more common and even more affordable.
So it's like he's using real-world data to create this kind of crystal ball, in a way, to try to see how automation might play out in the future.
That's a great way to put it. Now, obviously, no model is perfect, right? There are a lot of different factors that could influence how all this plays out in reality.
Of course, I mean, the future's always uncertain.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean that models like this aren't incredibly useful. They can help us to really think critically about the potential consequences of automation, to kind of anticipate challenges, and hopefully to develop solutions that are based on evidence, not just, on fear.
So it's about using these economic tools to help us make more informed decisions about how we approach the future of work.
Precisely. And that's what I find so fascinating about all of this. It's this intersection of economics, technology, social policy, all of it.
It's like we've got this roadmap, but it's just one possible path through this, like, crazy complicated jungle. But this whole thing about robots getting cheaper, that kind of raises another question for me. How much cheaper are we talking here?
Yeah.
And how does that play into this whole robot tax equation?
So that's where Sachs's model really gets down to brass tacks. He looks at different scenarios for how much and how quickly robot prices might fall in the future.
Okay.
And what he finds is that even with a much steeper drop in price than we've seen so far, even if robots become like totally ubiquitous in all sorts of industries, the optimal robot tax, the one that in theory would be best for everyone, it actually decreases.
Okay, wait, slow down a sec.
Okay.
So we're talking about a future where robots are even more common, way more affordable, and yet the best thing to do might be to tax them less. Am I getting that right?
You got it. It might seem kind of counterintuitive, but it goes back to those trade-offs we've been talking about. One of the biggest arguments against a robot tax is that it could discourage companies from investing in these new technologies, right?
Right.
So, in a future where robots are already everywhere, a core part of tons of industries, and their price tag is still dropping, the potential benefits of a robot tax, those benefits we talked about, like trying to curb inequality, those could actually be outweighed by the cost of slowing down technological development even further.
So it's like saying once the robots are out there, once they've changed the game, trying to rein them in with taxes could do more harm than good.
Right.
Like trying to stuff a genie back into a bottle.
That's a perfect analogy. And this finding, it really highlights something crucial here. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to the challenges that come with automation. What makes sense in the short term, when robots are still relatively new and expensive, it might not be the best approach 5, 10, 20 years down the line as technology evolves, prices change, and frankly, as our whole relationship with automation continues to evolve.
It's a good reminder that we need to be flexible. We need to be adaptable and constantly reevaluating our policies as new information comes to light.
100%. And that's what I really appreciate about Sachs's research. He doesn't sit here and pretend to have all the answers.
Right.
Instead, he gives us this framework for thinking critically about a very complex issue. He's challenging us to go beyond those gut reactions and emotional responses and really wrestle with the economic realities of automation.
It's a call to be informed, be thoughtful, really weigh those costs and benefits before jumping into any big decisions.
Exactly. And ultimately, I think the biggest takeaway here is that the future of work isn't some predetermined thing that just happens to us. It's something we can actively shape. It's something we shape through the choices we make, the policies we implement, the investments we prioritize.
So instead of just asking, should we tax robots? Maybe the better question is, how do we create a future where everyone benefits from these technological advancements, even as the very nature of work itself is changing? What do you think, listeners? What policies are you passionate about? What skills do we need to prioritize? The conversation worth having. So find us on social media. Let's keep this dialogue going. And hey, if you're not a bot, hit that subscribe button. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.